Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be examining the God in time. With me is my old friend and former college roommate from my undergraduate days at the University of Wisconsin, James P. Driscoll, who is one of the foremost critics of Renaissance literature from a Jungian perspective. He is the author of Identity in Shakespearean Drama, as well as The Unfolding God of Jung and Milton. In addition, he has recently published Shakespeare and Jung, The God in Time. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
It's good to be here again, Jeffrey.
You told me an interesting story with regard to the origination of your book, Shakespeare and Jung, The God in Time. It's almost reminiscent of some of Jung's own experiences, delving into the depth of his mind as he records in his Red Book.
I had thought about writing a book on time for a long time, but then I thought one was best to wait till one had experienced much of the course of a lifetime to write on time. Anyway, 10 years ago, almost exactly, and I was 66 at that time, and I had a severe bout of Crohn's, which was actually became quite life-threatening. And I was in the hospital here in Las Vegas, up in that ward where they put the people who are in danger of maybe not making it through the night, so the people who have to be watched regularly. And I probably was on morphine or something like that. And this figure appeared. And I've always referred to the figure as just a figure. Just by that term, Jung has gives them names like Philemon and so on, and many Jungians, I believe, have had experience like this. Well, it just appeared. I started asking questions, and he gave me a volume, two volumes, which were my life, and they were full of writing. And then the third volume was blank. And he said, well, you have to write that yourself. And later on in the day, or later on in the month, perhaps, I thought, well, maybe that means that I'm going to be living another significant space of time, and will have significant things to do in that time frame. And after that, the figure began to appear to me in like dreams. When I was in the hospital, it was like an actual physical presence. I suppose it was really a kind of dream, but it appeared to be like a physical an apparition, perhaps. And so I began to have these dreams, and I would question the figure, and but mostly about philosophical and religious things. It never got into talking about personal things, my relationships with people, world events, or anything like this. The figure did not seem to want to go there. Only philosophical things. And I would wake up in the morning and my head would be full of ideas on these philosophical subjects. And I started to write them down. And I continued to write them down on and off for many years. it sort of became intensified when I had a heart attack on an airplane several years later. And it was flying over your city of Albuquerque, in fact. And there was cardiologists on board who forced or persuaded somehow the pilot to turn the thing around, landed in Albuquerque, and probably saved my life. And I began to think then how Jung changed his interest, shifted his interest when he had his first heart attack. It was a strange heart attack because I didn't have a heart condition and didn't appear to do any damage, but they had to put in 3 stents and it could have killed me. But anyway, I continued to do that and became, as we got to about 2 years ago, I began to do it more and review my notes and so on. And I was on a cruise in about 18 months ago, and I met someone there, and I was telling him about my book, and he said, "Oh, totally unexpectedly, I have just inherited a press, and I want to do some interesting things. If you want to put your book together, I would like to consider publishing it." So that's what I did. I began to write up all these notes and insights from the dreams of the years into the book, which is now
there it is. Now, let me ask you this. You mentioned dreams. Were so many of these ideas coming to you in dreams?
Yes, very much so. Usually they would be things that would be in my head in the morning when I would wake up, and I would write them down. Now, sometimes I would be more stimulated in this area, and I would get ideas in the rest of the day. But usually they would start.
Jung himself developed a practice, I think at one point he called it active imagination, where he would deliberately pursue this dialogue, for example, with the image of Philemon, who became his major, I'll call him a spirit guide, for lack of a better word, or perhaps it was an archetype of some sort. But in any case, did you cultivate some sort of deliberate effort to keep that dialogue going with the image?
More when I got to actually writing the book. And sometimes I would have arguments with the figure and just tell him to go away. And it wasn't exactly that. I don't know that the figure ever appeared when I called him, although I would engage in the active imagination when writing the book, say, put the figure out there in my imagination and conduct a dialogue with him. But this was when things were much further along, not necessarily when the original insights for the book came. It was more like, how does this relate to something else? How does what Jung says relate to Whitehead or Shakespeare? That kind of thing. The original insights were never that sort of stuff, like, well, this is how Jung says it and Shakespeare says it and Whitehead says it in a different way. It wasn't like that. That was what I put together, but sometimes done through active imagination dialogue with the figure.
The book is somehow a joint product of your conscious mind and something coming from a deeper level than your conscious mind.
Yes, well, I would like to think that it has that, and also the minds of Jung, Alfred North Whitehead, and
the title mentions Shakespeare and Jung. It doesn't mention Whitehead.
I know, and my publisher said, I said to call it Jung and Shakespeare, the God in Time, or maybe the God in Time dash Jung and Shakespeare. And he said, no, begin with Shakespeare. Shakespeare sells. Jung sells somewhat, and And Whitehead doesn't sell at all, so leave him out of the title.
You know, I think a lot of our viewers will not be familiar with Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead. So perhaps you could summarize why you think his input was important.
Some people think he is the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and I think they might be right. Another contestant would be Wittgenstein, but I know many people have said that Principia Mathematica, which he wrote with Bertrand Russell, is one of the 20 or so great achievements of the human mind. He was an absolutely brilliant man, but he left mathematics after World War I. He had a son who was killed in World War I. And this turned his thoughts to the nature of God, justice in the universe, the problem of evil, and things like this. And so that probably is what turned him to philosophy, or at least it certainly colored his interest in and the topics he picked up. And he was very interested in the nature of God, which made him quite different from people like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, other English philosophers who didn't want to deal with God at all. And he was interested in metaphysics. But he is a very difficult philosopher. And that is one of the reasons why he's perhaps not well known. Also, he is sort of in a position by himself. He's a process philosopher. And one of the big ideas I develop in the book is that philosophers tend to fall in three categories: flux philosophers, process, and stasis. And those correspond really with the three tenses of time. Flux is the future. We don't know what it is. It's unpredictable. Process corresponds with the present, and stasis corresponds with the past, which is fixed. Now, some of the famous philosophers along those lines are many of the modern philosophers, such as Wittgenstein and Sartre, are flux philosophers. Scientific philosophy, positivism is flux. Marx is an area of flux. The great stasis philosopher of all time is Plato, of course. And process is a compromise position in the middle. Now, by my analysis, while Jung did not see himself as a metaphysician, and he wanted to be known as, a scientist, a clinical scientist, and he tried to avoid metaphysical pronouncements, but still his works are vast, and the number of things covered in his 20 volumes are also vast. And my sense of Jung is that he is essentially a process philosopher. Now, I also believe that that's the position of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is the great poet of time. He's generally regarded as the greatest of all poets. And his big theme, the one theme that interested him more than anything else, and he was interested in a tremendous variety of things, was time, the nature of time, how we deal with it, and he's really the great poet of time. And so what I found was that there are not many process philosophers. They tend to lump over in the area of flux or the area of stasis. And that's understandable psychologically, because process is a position that is more difficult to hold. If you're looking for certainties, you don't find so easily as you in stasis. That's full of certainties. And flux, you have the certainty of no certainties. But process is a more difficult to understand, and so I think Whitehead's a much neglected philosopher. I would say that process philosophy is something we would associate in our time. It's not necessarily, but it's the case. We associate flux with physics, and we might associate stasis with mathematics, and we could also associate process with biology. Of course, the greatest process in biology is evolution, but there are processes in the physical universe itself is a process. Formation of galaxies are a process, and so on. Interestingly enough, there's three, you might say, icons for time. The first is the circle, and Plato, the Hindus, basically all of the ancient Indo-European thought, whether it's in India or Greece or somewhere in between, looked at time as a circle. It's kind of an Indo-European thing. And then you have science, which looks at time as an ongoing flow, kind of a line. And that there are various philosophers in Greek who had that view, and Lucretius, the nature of things. Don't remember the Latin word, which is the actual title, but that's along those lines. And so you have the line and the circle, but process has its own symbol, and Whitehead specifically identified that it is the spiral, and that's really the symbol of the God of Whitehead's universe, I would almost say. And it's, of course, written everywhere. You get a telescope and you look out into the universe and you see spirals everywhere. And not all galaxies are spirals, of course, but it's the most common form. And you see it, there's a spiral in the DNA. The water goes down the drain in the spiral, and so on. It's a fundamental image, and that's the image of time that's consistent with process philosophy. It has an advantage. It's like a circle in that it repeats, but it's also like a line in that it goes somewhere. The circle just repeats. It doesn't go anywhere. And like in Nietzsche, he talks about eternal return. And it's not going anywhere. We're just going to come back here in X number of years and we will be doing this interview just exactly the way we're doing it. And the line, of course, goes on and on to new things, but nothing is repeated. And the idea of process, the spiral, allows for patterns that are repeated and structure things, and yet things are at the same time new, as they are in a flux, where everything is new, and stasis, nothing is new, and there's a combination.
I suppose it's worth mentioning, at least parenthetically, that Alfred North Whitehead was an inspiration to my mentor, whom I know you also knew, Arthur M. Jung, who considered himself a process philosopher.
Yes, I do remember that Arthur was a process philosopher, and he had quite an elaborate system. And I think I also remember that he was an admirer of Whitehead, but he was a very imaginative and in certain ways insightful man. So it doesn't surprise me that he would pick as Whitehead as the preeminent philosopher that he looked to. I assume that he looked at Whitehead more than he did to Plato or Wittgenstein or anyone else.
Well, I think when he
correct,
chose to call himself a process philosopher, he was referring very specifically to Whitehead.
Yes, yeah. And process philosophy, I think, has the potential of getting us out of a lot of dilemmas with ideas in philosophy, but also as you apply these things to practical life. And I think our culture would be healthier if it were more oriented towards process philosophy rather than, as it is now, it's kind of like warring opposites of flux and stasis. Stasis view being associated commonly with, say, the Catholic Church. It's stasis philosophy. And say Marxism would be associated with flux. And if there is a kind of dialectical merging in the future, that would be in more of a process point of view, which in my view would be more realistic and healthier and less conflict written.
Now, you and I have had a number of conversations while you were writing the book, and one of the questions that you asked, and I thought it was pretty crucial, is this notion that God and time are very close to each other, maybe even identical, maybe even the case that God is time, although God might be much more than time. But one of the thoughts that you had is we may never know, with our little human brains, whether or not this is true. But the very thought that God might be equivalent to time was a new, original idea, and therefore, whether or not it's true, so to speak, it's worthy of examination.
I say at one place in the book that God and time are two different sides of the same coin, two different faces of the same coin. And it's just two different ways of looking at the same thing. Time basically and ultimately is change. But, that's one feature of time. It's just change. The book is titled The God in Time. And so what in time is God? Well, it's the structure of time, the patterns, the process that is God. But of course, the process doesn't exist without the things that are in process. So you can't totally separate them. And that's that's kind of a problem in philosophy. Plato and people following wanted to separate. They wanted to stick God outside the universe because the universe isn't perfect. Our lives aren't perfect. We die, we suffer. There's injustice, disappointment. And God is supposed to be perfect. So he can't really be in the universe. He's got to be outside the universe. I reject that idea. They also thought that God had to be totally masculine. He couldn't have a feminine side because that would be imperfection. That's also something that I would reject, and probably most people would today. But it's sort of amazing, really, how locked we remain in some of our basic thinking in our culture in ideas that were formulated upon experiences that occurred and cultural knowledge that occurred 2,500 years ago. And there are certain new bits of information that I think, changed things. Like I put the picture of this galaxy on the front of the book, and that galaxy is 9.6 billion light years from here. It's so far away that, and it's traveling so fast that we can never get there. But it's one of the largest galaxies we've discovered, and that's one of. We think there are 3 trillion galaxies, and there are 300 billion stars in our galaxy. Well, the God, actual God, the God in time, has to be the God in that galaxy as well as here and everywhere in between. And that's just not how people were thinking of God 2,500 years ago or even 500 years ago. I mean, it's only been, you may remember better than I do, how long ago was it that we discovered that we are in fact in the galaxy and there are other galaxies
maybe in the
out
1920s.
I sort of think so. In other words, it's an idea that is a bit more recent
I think
than
it's
evolution.
the work of Hubble that we came to this understanding.
But it's a totally key thing for understanding the universe in which we reside, rather than this old idea pre-Copernicus that the sun is the big light that revolves around us and we're the center of everything. A laughable idea. But the problem is that our philosophies and religions that these basic ideas are crucial to formulating any philosophy and religion. Where do you think? What is the universe like? Where did man come from? What is the nature of life? These sort of things are fundamental. And we haven't adopted new philosophies and religious insights to these. Now, I think thinkers like Jung and Whitehead particularly are not dated in that way. That's one of the reasons I find those two people attractive. They're not dated in that way at all. And they have done profound thinking on the subject of religion, and in Whitehead's case, religion and philosophy, or metaphysical philosophy, the big philosophical questions, whereas it may be that Wittgenstein and Sartre aren't dated, but they never had anything other than, or never expressed anything other than a superficial interest in religion.
So your concern primarily when you think of God is what you are calling actual God, which is a God, a deity that exists completely independent of human cultural traditions.
It's completely independent of human cultural traditions, but that doesn't mean that it's completely alien to them, or completely, or that we are completely incapable of relating to it in any way. I think mysticism is essentially an attempt to relate to this God, to actual God, although in most cultures they confuse actual God with their cultural Godhead. But the cultural Godhead is a kind of God, I think, in that one way I've looked at it as a collective autonomous complex. You know what an autonomous complex is within the psyche, and it can be like even a separate personality, or certainly it's a complex of archetypes and psychic energies that have either not necessarily total independence, but have their own kind of territory. Like Jupiter has its own gravitational field within the solar system, and so do we. Well, these cultural godheads, that's the term the Jung likes to use for them as Godhead, they can be tremendously influential. Now, I've not put a lot of thought into anything other than the Western Godhead, but this is one of the things that I do discuss in the book extensively, which is how the Western Godhead has influenced our culture, that the very archetypes that are active in this Godhead, and by the Western Godhead, I mean, it begins with Abraham and the Old Testament, and this figure moves through. There was really, it was kind of a coalescing of gods or ideas, mythic fragments in the Hebraic culture that coalesced into Yahweh. And that developed from Moses. It was there before, but from Moses on, it went through an evolution. And originally it was this nasty, tyrannical, excitable, irrational deity that Jung discusses in answer to Job. And Jung reacted very strongly against that. And he said that, well, God realizes, because of his abuse of Job, that he causes suffering for man. And so he comes again as Christ, not to redeem man from his sins, but to understand man, understand his creation better. And so Jung, throughout his life, wrestled with this idea, well, what is God really like? One of his points was that God has to be a quaternity, because he saw the self as four-part, and there's the thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation functions. There's all sorts of fours. That carries over into the Orient and other cultures where this four is this figure of wholeness and unity in the mandalas. And he said, Trinity is unstable. You need a fourth. So he was looking for a fourth, and his candidates were Satan and Mary. But back to the influence. The Christian God had, as I see it, two preeminent qualities, two words, love and truth. And truth is a little bit less clear in the New Testament than love, but it's still very much there. And there was a kind of marriage between the Judeo-Christian tradition and Hellenism. And of course, the Greeks emphasized truth. But as you got into Christianity, you had these two big ideas, God as truth and God as love. And so by understanding the truth, what the world really is like, and so on, you were understanding God. And that was something that furthered science. And if you look at the sciences, not today, but of a few hundred years ago, Newton, for example, they saw their pursuit of scientific understanding as a religious pursuit, not in opposition to Christianity at all, but a furtherance of it. And this is of tremendous importance. That this isn't the case in Islam, because God was bound by truth and God was bound by love. It may be all powerful, but he couldn't alter the past. He couldn't change the laws of the universe once he'd established them. And he couldn't do anything that was evil or unloving. In Islam, he can do all those things. He's all powerful, and if you put any limitations on him, that's blasphemy, because the essence of this God, their God, is not truth and love. It is power. And so, but these basic concepts of the God and the nature of God were something that, in my view, and I'm not alone in this by any means, this furthered the development of science and technology. Technology because it was good to make people's lives easier and better. It was a loving thing to do. And so technology is good. Technology wasn't necessarily good for the Romans. We had Tiberius outlawed some new type of glass that did not break easily because he thought it would put the glass makers out of work. And things like this. They didn't have the idea of progress at all with the Romans. But this, it wasn't there initially, but it began to develop in the Middle Ages. And it came out, the Middle Ages, of course, were deeply Christian. And technology did not start at the Renaissance. It started in the Middle Ages. It was going as a force several centuries before Leonardo and Shakespeare and the big figures of the Renaissance. I'm saying that the Godhead that the West worships and the Islamic God and so on, they're realities. But they're a different reality from actual God, but people don't make that distinction.
I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that these cultural godheads are like autonomous archetypes within the collective consciousness of a civilization.
Exactly. That's exactly what they are. Now, they affect people differently. And they're complexes, meaning it's more than one part to it. Like if the quaternity, it has 4 parts. And people will be affected quite differently by it. Some will, for example, someone like Mother Teresa or St. Francis, they're very much, you might even say, possessed by the Jesus archetype as the loving being, healing, serving other people, and so on. Other people, they have different approaches that come from different aspects of the Godhead. But the Godhead is like this uber power that has this great influence over the civilization. I don't think it's really waning. I think it's just changing. I do remember a couple of years ago, I visited the island of Delos in Greece. And Delos was said to be the birthplace of Apollo. And it was this tremendously important place. And you can go there, and the island is just almost like a sandbar. It's maybe a square mile. It's tiny, but 20,000 people lived there, and it was like a powerful center, like Jerusalem. And now there's nothing there but a bunch of archaeologists and tourists who visit every day, because that god and the Greek pantheon essentially have all basically died. They don't have any power in the collective psyche of that civilization, the way they did in Hellenic times. And that could happen with the Christian God or the Islamic God, too. They're sustained by the psychic energy of the people in the civilization or the culture, whereas actual God is not sustained by that.
And you enumerate certain properties of actual God that would distinguish it from a civilizational God. And I think foremost amongst those is the creation of meaning.
Yes, and they're connected with time. And time is irreversible and another thing that's unique about time is uniqueness itself. Everything in our universe is unique because even if two things seem to be exactly the same, they're not in the same place. And part of what they are is where they are. And both in time and in space. So everything is unique, even if two atoms, you may think they're the same, but they're not. And have one atom here, another one here. Gravity and all sorts of forces are acting on those in different ways. And that's part of what they are. So everything is unique. And since time is irreversible, nothing lasts. But this gives actual meaning and value to things, their uniqueness and their fleeting, ephemeral quality. Now, that may not be, that's the fundamental of value and meaning. It may not be meaningful in itself to individuals, but it's what makes meaning possible for individuals and gives them the opportunity to create things that are emotionally meaningful for themselves. It's a difficult concept, I know, but without this uniqueness and this irreversibility, without time, there couldn't be any meaning or value. There couldn't be any consciousness either. There would be nothing.
Or everything all at once.
Well, everything all at once is what we have now.
Now, why do you say that? Because of time, we don't have everything all at once.
Well, that's true. We don't. We have everything in the moment all at once, but there's the past and the future. Infinite complexity going on.
But what you're pointing out is that time is what creates meaning because of the fact that events unfold in a sequence and because of the uniqueness of each event.
Yes, and because you can't do things over.
Therefore, I think you're arguing that time has qualities that are traditionally ascribed to the ultimate deity, the source of meaning.
Well, yes, time has qualities just as space has qualities. And you know, in space, there are gravitational fields and electromagnetic fields. Now, one of the ideas in my book is that there are fields in time fields, time frames. And I borrowed a word from the science fiction TV program, Doctor Who, TARDIS, to refer to some of these time fields. And it's like, again, the image of the solar system. You have the sun, but then Jupiter has its own gravitational and other fields, and each of those moons does, and so on. And they interact in different ways. Well, within time, I see, and I think Jung saw, and this was in his concept of synchronicity, the archetypes set up fields in time. Single archetypes become very powerfully activated, and they influence everything like a gravitational field around them, or complexes of archetypes too. And so it's not like it's just
No, Jung ascribed, as I recall, the Second World War to the rising of the Wotan archetype in the consciousness of the German population.
Yes, and you can interpret a large number of historic events in terms of rising archetype. There was a rising archetype in the United States, for example, that made us look at slavery as immoral and drove the abolitionist movement and so on. It was not just in the United States. It was processing through the centuries, but there was an archetypal complex there, which we would see as ideas, but at the same time, they were archetypes. Like, we know the space is not uniform, and we tend to assume that time is, but it isn't. Now, that doesn't mean things can go back in time, but that means that there are these fields and these variations, and areas of time have certain qualities that distinguish them from another area of time.
So you're suggesting, I suppose, that as time moves forward, different facets of the deity, of actual God, are revealing themselves.
I would say different facets of the civilizational Godhead are revealing themselves and unfolding. And with actual God, we are discovering. I'm not so sure that I'd go so far as to say actual God is revealing itself to us, that we are discovering. Whereas the civilizational Godhead is more, as this autonomous complex. It's more like a personality that has intentions. Those intentions are driven by archetypes, of course, and if there are choices made, they're made by the collective coming together in these difficult to understand ways that, how does a group of people make a decision? Well, it's not the same way as a single person makes a decision. Well, maybe it is, according to you, because you would see your decisions would be the interplay of your anima and your shadow and your persona and all sorts of forces within your psyche. And if you have a group of people, the Supreme Court, for example, there's an interplay of these 9 personalities. And in the Godhead, there's an interplay of the various archetypes that compose the Godhead. But that's not true, so far as we know or I know, of actual God. I don't see there as an interplay.
But you are suggesting that actual God is discoverable.
Yes. But not that there is one playbook or formula for discovering it. That we are discovering it through the human experience. And particularly in the West, because we have science and we have arts and philosophies that are more complicated and develop and more interactive with the general world than in other civilizations. We're on a quest for discovering this actual God. And at the same time, to a certain extent, this quest is guided by the civilizational Godhead. So those who want to believe that our own religious tradition has a certain validity that is, they're not being baseless. Jung said, however, that you were best to pursue these big questions in terms of your own tradition. In other words, he didn't think it was a good idea for Westerners to go to China or India and try to learn those traditions and try to discover them. They should do it in terms of their own. Similarly, that the Indians and the Chinese needed to do it in terms of their own. So I think that that's correct, that I wouldn't be saying that these other civilizations are, that they're false gods or that they're invalid. They have a different way of pursuing things than we do. And being born and growing up in this civilization, it's the one I understand. It's the one that's valid for me to pursue, but not necessarily for somebody in
Well, let me ask you this question, Jim. You refer to the various chapters in your book as meditations. It's really, as you describe it, a collection of meditations. How are you using the term meditation?
That's a good question and a difficult one. For one thing, I was thinking in terms of Marcus Aurelius and sometimes in terms of Montaigne. But there are, I would say, a flow of thought on a particular subject or set of subjects. And meditation, I suppose, meaning that it was like the creation was like a meditation, because I would start out with a seminal idea and then continue adding to it, sometimes over the years. And as I would see, this is what I'm dealing with here in this meditation, and Whitehead and Jung have some things to say, or Shakespeare or somebody else that is relevant, so I bring them in.
Well, James P. Driscoll, this has been a very interesting excursion into what I think of as an important book, probably a seminal book, because it does contain some very original thinking about the relationship between God and time. I encourage our viewers to take a look at it, and I thank you for being with me.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, again, for the opportunity to bring some of these ideas. And I certainly hope your assessment is correct, your generous assessment.